Thank you, Anne, and welcome to everyone who is joining us, and a special welcome to our guest, Kirsten. Before we get to the introductions, I just wanted to say, it's really our pleasure to have to be able to host this event today virtually. For those who don't know, Mapping Prejudice Project, by way of a quick introduction, it really is a project that has explored the connection between racial restrictive covenants and disparities that we see today in homeownership, in particular with people of color. And it's something that's a point of passion for our board members and association, as well as our leadership. And I am very proud of the work that we've done over the last few years with this project, as well as the incredible national visibility that this leadership is getting right now. Through our local efforts, and to know that we've been a part of supporting it. We've had a long multi-year relationship, for those who aren't aware and weren't involved with Minneapolis area Realtors, both through financial support to help fund the work and make sure it could be completed for Hennepin County, as well as through realtor engagement. Some of our past presidents getting very involved and making sure that we were really bringing this work to the forefront as far as education and getting our members to understand the part that many of our membership might not have realized that we had played in this community. So we're excited to have that. And for those who are unfamiliar, sorry, hang on, I'm in my house. Well, anyway, so the joys of working from home. So with that, just for those who weren't aware, that even our Realtor Code of Ethics, which actually stated that it was against our code to integrate neighborhoods and to sell homes to minority groups, which I was, learning about that as I joined the association and got into this industry. It's such an important part of our history, and not so that we can feel, ashamed or guilty about the past, but so that we can reconcile with it and lead forward into a better place. So I'm excited about what this project enables us to do in terms of education, so that we can, there is an end goal in mind there around creating more equitable housing for all. With that, I also want to just ask if Lyndon, our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee Chair, would like to share anything about how important this is to our group as far as the effects of the past practices and how we plan to move forward.
Yes, Carrie, thank you. We've just started our relationship with Mapping Prejudice a couple years ago, and we've had one before, Kristen, or two?
At least two, I would say.
Yeah, about two of these presentations, and it's really amazing to find out us as an industry, how we kind of started this whole thing going on, and the reason why we want to get everybody educated on this is, when the first time I saw it, I was just amazed and astounded how the effect that we had on this as an industry, and now that we kind of changed and trying to get out of this, it was important to get everybody else educated on this. So as a whole, as a group, we can do something to try to rectify these past injustices going forward. So, Carrie, I don't know, you might want to talk a little bit more of why it is important and how that we just rectify these past injustices.
Yes, well, and I did want to thank you, Lyndon, and I just want to say how important it has been that it's the members, this is from the membership and the volunteers who, really are out there doing the work, that I think it's going to be a critical place where this vision comes to life. And so which is why we host events like this. And I do want to just give a shout out about our partnership, that it's not just MAR doing this work, it's also SPAR. So St. Paul Association is very much engaged in this, and in fact just committed another $50,000 grant as well in terms of financial support. And there's opportunity for all of you listening to get involved. They're hosting 2 work sessions for volunteers to come and learn more and become trained, as a lot of this work has been crowdsourced And so it's a great opportunity to get involved. And they have that on their website. So you can check out SPAR's website. If you're interested in learning more, do it soon because they have dates, I think, slated for September 15th and the 24th. So if you're interested in getting more hands-on and learning more after this, please do seek that out. They'd love to have you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker then. And so just a quick, by way of bio, Kristen Delagard is the director and one of the co-founders of the Mapping Prejudice Project. It's located here at the University of Minnesota, and she is a local, okay, it says Minneapolitan, which I don't know, basically to Minneapolis, third generation, and a public historian. And so as a part of that, she wanted to establish the Mapping Prejudice Project. And Kristen is also a graduate of the Minneapolis public school system and Wesleyan University. She holds a PhD in history from Duke University and has a faculty affiliation here with the Department of Geography, Environment and Society, and the Heritage Studies and Public History program at the University of Minnesota. So obviously a very accomplished person in our presence today, and someone who's in extremely high demand, not just regionally, but on a national stage right now with this topic, really achieving what, the visibility that I think it really deserves at last. And so thank you for making the time to join us today. And with that, we'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Before I get started and share my screen and dive into my PowerPoint, I want to say a couple of things. I'll talk more about our process, but it really is the whole map that you're going to see has been built by volunteers. We have had close to 5,000 volunteers, and some of our first and most enthusiastic volunteers were realtors like you. That this project absolutely could not have gotten off the ground without some of the first people I had conversations about this with were realtors that I knew here in Minneapolis. So I've always seen realtors as a really critical stakeholder group for this work. You are the first teachers, for a lot of people who are buying a home. You're the people who can answer the questions when people maybe become aware of this history, but also maybe find a covenant in the deed of a house that they might be considering buying. And I can share, there's examples of people all over the country who have this moment of where they're forced to confront this history, as they purchase a new property. So I think I've always seen realtors as a really, really key group of teachers, I guess, and that's the way I like to think of you. And SPAR has been a wonderful partner, financial, as Mar was I want to say Mar was first to the game here, but SPAR has, I'll stoke that St. Paul, Minneapolis rivalry a little bit there. But SPAR has provided us with financial support. They've also created a traveling exhibit on this history, which I know we're not going into a lot of public places, but if any of you are doing an event where you could imagine having some kind of traveling exhibit as part of the space, you can contact SPAR and they will lend it out to any group. So maybe that's something for the future to think about. So and in terms of our work sessions, we are doing some that are specifically geared at realtors with SPAR, but we also have weekly work sessions, volunteer sessions that you can find through our website. We alternate between the afternoon and the evening. So if you have any questions about how to find those, please let me know. Okay, with that, I'm going to dive in here and start my presentation. So thank you again so much for having me. Over the last, so we started in 2016. Over the last couple of years, I have given dozens of talks about mapping prejudice, and of course over time, as I have talked, I would say that my message has become more pointed. You know, I share our data, I describe this history, but I would say I would distill my message in this way. And I would say we have the highest racial disparities in the country here in the Twin Cities. This is immoral, it's unjust, but it's also unsustainable. That this kind of inequality is going to rip our community apart. And then, of course, as all of you know all too well, on the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was murdered here in Minneapolis. And on this corner of 38th and Chicago, demonstrations and civil unrest spread throughout the rest of the world. So what began here in Minneapolis has actually mushroomed into what is the largest protest in American history. In the month after George Floyd's murder, approximately 20 million Americans took this to the streets to join public demonstrations for Black Lives Matter. So in the wake of these events, as this movement started rippling actually around the world, my little team started getting inquiries from every point of the globe, and most of the people who contacted us had the same question. It was, why Minneapolis? How did this start here? And obviously that's a longer discussion. That's something that we're all going to be talking about in this community, I think, for decades to come. But our team has been able to provide one small slice of this larger explanation. You know, we've been able to share this history of racial covenants and what I have come to think of as the willful amnesia around this history of discriminatory housing practices in Minneapolis. And that's, of course, what I'm going to be talking about today. I think it's really important to situate myself in this story, to tell you who I am. As Carrie said, I'm a graduate of the Minneapolis Public Schools. I'm actually a third-generation Minneapolitan. So what that means is that my grandparents started coming to Minneapolis in the 1920s, and my family actually never left. It's a familiar story to a lot of you. I did leave when I was 18, and I, of course, told my parents that I was never going to move back and never going to live at home, you know, never going to live in Minneapolis again. And I went and I traveled the world and I trained as a professional historian, and I did, of course, come back. And it was at that point that I just decided that I wanted to explore the history of my hometown. With this decision, I was immediately forced to confront some of the central teachings of my childhood, the things that I was taught by my parents and teachers and community members when I was growing up here. I was growing up in the 1970s in Minneapolis, what I call the Mary Tyler Moore era of Minneapolis, when downtown Minneapolis was on, you know, national television every day with every week with Mary Tyler Moore throwing her hat into the air, and that was part of a larger image of Minneapolis, which was seen both here locally, but also around the country, as a city that was immune from many of the challenges of what was known then as the urban crisis. Of course, this narrative has come increasingly under challenge, especially in the last 10 years. But I would say until Memorial Day, until George Floyd's death, I believe that most white Minnesotans really remained invested in this idea that the largest city in the state, in the words of the New York Times, really seemed to have all the answers. A lot of people nodded in agreement when this commentary was published in The Atlantic, which, you know, went so far as to call Minneapolis a miracle. So like many of my neighbors, I appreciate the things that have brought my hometown these kinds of accolades: the parks, the arts, the communitarian impulses of my neighbors, the sense of investment in community. I'm really grateful for the strong economy that has allowed so many generations of my family to thrive here. But ultimately, this talk of miracles was destructive. It eclipsed what this pandemic that we're all living through right now and the murder of George Floyd has made absolutely impossible to ignore. Minnesota, in the words of so many of my Black neighbors, is a great place to live if you're white. It's not so nice to be a person of color here. So let's just look at the numbers. Our racial disparities are the highest in the country by many measures. What does this mean? It means that Black people are way more likely than white residents to suffer poverty, to experience violence, to struggle with chronic illness. They're way less likely to graduate from high school. Housing is key to these other disparities, is absolutely the bedrock of so many other inequalities. Without safe and affordable housing, it's almost impossible to access healthcare, to access education. In a global pandemic, you certainly can't shelter in place. You're way more vulnerable to crime. So that's one of the reasons that Mapping Prejudice is focused on housing specifically. But to believe in this, this miracle of Minneapolis, you have to ignore this inequality. You have to ignore racism, and you have to silence the past. You have to forget deliberately how we got to the place that we are today. Black people have never had the luxury of this forgetting. And what our project is doing is we're calling on everyone in the community to remember collectively. These contemporary racial disparities are not the result of some natural order or personal choices. Our map illuminates how developers used racial covenants to reserve huge swaths of land for the exclusive use of white people at a really critical moment of development for the city. So in Minneapolis here, this practice started in 1910. That's the year that Henry and Leonora Scott sold a property on 35th Avenue South to a man named Nels Anderson. He was a Swedish baker, and his home was extremely modest. It had a chicken coop out back, but the deed for this property included this racial restriction that I put on the screen here. It stipulated that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. The pioneer of this practice, the man who actually wrote that restriction, his name was Edmund Walton. And he led the Seven Oaks Corporation. That was one of the largest real estate development companies of its time in the Twin Cities. And that company alone put this same language into thousands and thousands of deeds across Hennepin, and now we know across Ramsey County. So I'm going to read you some of these deeds, not this same language, the Walton language. And I do this in every presentation because I think that's when the real understanding comes, when people hear the language of these historical property records. And it's important, we're doing this even though the language is upsetting. We're not doing it to upset people, we're doing it because it's important to be really clear about what we're talking about here, that we're naming racism, that we're naming whiteness. We want everyone to hear what these covenants sounded like. So this first covenant, which was actually put into place in 1946, said, no person of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. This one is from St. Paul, and it was put into place in 1948. It reads, the said premises shall be occupied only by persons of the Caucasian race. This one says, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. So this is hard to hear. I always tell people to be sure to take a breath. So we've been leading community members in the work of mapping these restrictions, first in Hennepin County, now in Ramsey County. My far more technologically savvy colleagues have used computer scripts to comb through millions of property records to identify the documents that seem to have this language. Then they uploaded these deeds that were flagged as seeming to be likely to have this language to a crowdsourcing platform. And we invite volunteers to extract the information that we need to put these restrictions on a map. So in Hennepin County, we had a little more than 3,000 volunteers who read 177,000 historic property deeds. Our volunteers were very proud and very humbled by the fact that our volunteers donated 14,000 hours of labor to this research. And that labor led to the identification of 24,000 property parcels that have these the racial covenants. So here's the result. What you're looking at here is a time-lapse map of racial covenants in Hennepin County through time. So the upper right-hand corner shows the year and the tally of covenants. Each blue dot, you see these blobs, those are clusters of racial covenants. So property parcels that were reserved through these legal contracts for the exclusive use of white people. So we're very proud of the fact that this is the first map of its kind. No one has ever been able to do this before, because we were able to leverage these new technologies, these new digital tools. But we're especially proud of the fact that we did it in collaboration with community members. And we found that the building of the map, and then the data set that it creates, and obviously the visualization, has been a really powerful platform for policymaking, for research, and for me, what makes me most excited, community conversations like this one. So to really understand, though, the import of, why are we studying racial covenants? I read you the language to show you how explicitly racist these contracts were. This map that's running on your screen, it shows you that these aren't isolated contracts. These are not unusual restrictions. These are incredibly widespread. But it's also really important to understand how powerful these restrictions were. These were not easily challenged. And to fully grasp why that is the case, you have to understand how they were enforced. Obviously, they're contracts, so they're backed up by the full power of the American judicial system. Covenants ran with the land, which meant that it didn't matter. They're embedded in the land, not in the structures on the land. So it didn't matter how many times houses were torn down or constructed. The property remained restricted by race. And it also meant that it didn't matter how many times that property changed hands, that they could be enforced, covenants could be enforced through the court system decades after they were embedded into these deeds. And anyone who decided that they wanted to breach one of these covenants really risked ending up in court. And the penalty for breaching one of these restrictions was to lose the property altogether. Breaching the covenant would result, if you were brought into court, it would result in the property reverting to the person who put the covenant on in the first place. If in the case of Edmund Walton, he's dead, it would go to his daughters, his heirs. But here's one of the painful truths about this. Across the country, across the United States, most white people weren't interested in challenging covenants because they thought they were necessary. Black people, by contrast, saw covenants for what they were, which was a threat to basic liberty. Here in the Twin Cities, we had leaders like Nellie Francis, Marvel Jackson, Lena Olive Smith, and Katie McWatt, who devoted their lives to fighting these practices. And it wasn't unique here. It was all over the country. Black people put everything on the line to challenge these restrictions. They bought houses with covenants. They moved into white neighborhoods. And this is what Arthur and Edith Lee did in 1931. I'm guessing that many of you might have heard this story. Arthur and Edith Lee and their daughter Mary, who was just about to enter kindergarten, bought a tiny white bungalow on the corner of 46th and Columbus Avenue in South Minneapolis in the summer of 1931. Once word got out that this little family was going to be moving into the house, the neighbors reacted with outrage. They asked the Lees to not move in. They tried to buy the house back from them. They called the real estate agent. They called the bank. They threatened the Lees. And when the Lees persisted and insisted on moving into their new home, they organized a mob. Arthur called the Minneapolis police for help in keeping this angry mob at bay. The police said that they weren't willing to get involved with a private property dispute. The only reason that the house is still standing today, the only reason it wasn't burned down and the family wasn't murdered, is that Arthur was also an Army veteran, and he was able to call on his other veterans, and they actually formed an armed perimeter around the house to protect the family. But the family still had to sleep in the basement because there was so many things were being thrown through the window, stones, bricks, bullets were being shot through the house. And one neighbor described it like this. He said, 6,000 white people just waiting to see that house burned. They didn't just show up for 1 week or 1 day. They were there, camped out around this house all summer long in the summer of 1931. And I tell this story in part to illustrate the fact that as these racial boundaries were hardening in American cities during this period, during the first half of the 20th century, this threat of this kind of white violence was ever present. This was one of the main ways that covenants were enforced. People didn't bother going to court. They called together a mob like the one that took shape on Columbus Avenue. So there were many families like the Lees, though, who worked with the NAACP, which gave them critical assistance and support. I think it's really important to give a shout out right now to Lena Olive Smith, who was the first female president of the NAACP in Minneapolis. She became the Lees lawyers. Before she went to law school, she had been a realtor. She had been involved in the realty industry, in part because she knew how important it was to help people acquire property. So the NAACP, obviously one of the most the prominent civil rights organizations of the 20th century. That organization brought a series of court challenges that ended up at the United States Supreme Court in 1948. And that was the year that the Supreme Court declared covenants to be unenforceable in a famous case called Shelley v. Kramer. Unfortunately, that court case was not the end of covenants. And here in Minnesota, legislators actually were forced to pass a new law in 1953 that made it illegal to put new covenants in place. That it didn't do anything to touch old covenants. So again, legislators returned and made another law in 1962, which was the Minnesota Fair Housing Law of 1962, which banned covenants and redlining. And it wasn't until 1968 that the federal government followed suit with the Fair Housing Act. And obviously that's remembered as one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation. And I'm sure it's familiar to all of you as, you know, as your training as realtors. I would say that when this story, the story of covenants, the history of covenants has been told a lot of times, it's ended right at that point with the passage of the Fair Housing Act. But it's our contention at Mapping Prejudice that ending that narrative there would be misleading, because we're still living with the legacies of these policies. To really understand how deep the impact was of covenants, I think it's important to return to 1910, the moment that covenants were introduced into the landscape here, and talk about what the city looked like at that moment. When the first covenant was introduced in 1910, there were only 2,700 Black people in Minneapolis. What I put up here on the screen is a map of census demographic data from that year. Here's what it shows. It shows that the city was not particularly segregated at that point. The darker colored polygons indicate the presence of Black families all over especially the southern half of the city. What we know from looking at census records and newspaper records and other archival materials is that Black families were buying property all over the city and helping their friends and family members do the same thing. In 1910, the neighborhood that had the highest percentage of Black residents was near North Minneapolis. That's that darker colored polygon there. But even that area was only 15% Black. We have Black families living near Lake Harriet, near Lake Nokomis, along the shores of the Mississippi River on West River Parkway. So I tell these stories because it's important to realize that this could have continued. Black people could have been allowed to stay put, to spread out in the growing city, but there was a very conscious choice to make a change at this moment. There was this sense, not just in Minneapolis, but around the country, that integrated neighborhoods were actually dangerous. And when the Minneapolis Journal published an editorial around this time, it was in recognition of this national sentiment that integrated neighborhoods were a menace to sort of community prosperity and stability. The Minneapolis Journal called on the real estate board, actually, to contain what it described as a, quote, considerable Negro colony. And the real estate board responded by publishing the clause in the ethics manual that Carrie mentioned in her opening remarks. I'm going to share it right here. This is the Code of Ethics that was published in 1913, which said that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing in a neighborhood or a character of property or occupancy members of any race or nationality or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So today, obviously, we call that real estate steering, and it's important to understand that this real estate steering worked in tandem with these covenants to really reshape American cities in this time. That realtors were really in the forefront of helping to establish what was known as the racial character of a neighborhood. And in the decades that followed, these practices really changed the racial geography of American cities. So here's what that looked like in Minneapolis. So you remember the map from 1910 that I showed you is on the left. After 3 decades, by 1940, the city had looked very different. As you can see, I have a map from 1940 on the right side of the screen now. By mid-century, Black people had been pushed out of all but a few neighborhoods in Minneapolis. The Black residents we tracked down by Lake Harriet, they're all gone. Same story around Lake Nokomis. By 1940, there's no census district in Northeast Minneapolis that has more than one Black person in it. And for the first time in the city's history, you have multiple census districts that are predominantly Black. So what this means is that by 1940, after covenants had been in place for 30 years, race determined your place of residence in the city of Lakes. Blacks were just concentrated into a couple of small neighborhoods. So the way this this residential segregation has traditionally been explained is that it's some kind of rational response to the Great Migration. So the Great Migration is, of course, the movement of Black people from the rural South to the urban North. And the idea is that, oh, well, of course, when people were new to the city, they settled near friends and family members. They sort of recreated villages from the South in northern cities. That just doesn't hold up in Minneapolis, because Minneapolis was not an endpoint for the Great Migration until the 1950s or 1960s. So in these two maps, this 1910 map on the left and this 1940 map on the right, it's the same people. It's the same people who are moved around in the city. People were forced out of integrated parts of the city and concentrated into these pockets that pop here on the map. You have the near north side, you have the old south side, you have what we now call Cedar Riverside, and we have the Hiawatha corridor. And this is in no way unique to Minneapolis. This is happening everywhere across the country at the same time. This urban reshuffling, this segregation by race. Across the nation, Blacks, in the words of the poet Langston Hughes, were, quote, hemmed in. That's the title of a poem that he wrote in 1949, describing his situation in Chicago. The poem, it reads this way. It says, "They've got covenants restricting me, hemmed in on the south side, can't breathe free." 71 years later, Black people are still struggling to breathe in Minneapolis. Please, 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 I can't breathe. That's what George Floyd pleaded as he laid pinned under the knee of a police officer this spring. The death of Mr. Floyd grows out of the structural racism that's so entrenched in Minneapolis. Residential segregation today in Minneapolis is just one manifestation of this structural racism. This segregation, once it was established in the early 20th century, has just remained stubbornly entrenched. What this map shows is it shows the neighborhoods that once had covenants in them are still the whitest parts of the city today. The red on the map shows the covenants, and you can see that they're clustered on the sections of the map that are white, which indicates a concentration of white people. And there are a lot of neighborhoods in Minneapolis in particular that have a high concentration of white people. And this has not really been seen as problematic in any way. Instead, I would say all the policymaking attention has been directed at Black neighborhoods, concentration of Blackness. And the policy solutions that have come out of that focus just have not been particularly effective. One scholar sums it up this way. She says, basically, whatever the problem is in the American city, the answer is to move the Black people. One way that this was done was through freeway construction. So in the 1950s, when freeways were being plotted through the Twin Cities and through communities across the country, freeways were regarded as critical to the growth of new white suburbs. And the commuters needed a way to get from their new homes in these in suburbs like Golden Valley or St. Louis Park or Edina or Richfield or Bloomington to their jobs in the urban core, in the downtown. Freeways were also seen as having another benefit, and that was to be engines of what was known as urban renewal. Their construction was used very explicitly to clear neighborhoods that urban planners regarded as blighted. And what this map shows is what neighborhoods were regarded in that way. It shows our contemporary freeways overlaid on that fine-grained demographic map I showed you from 1940. You can see the neighborhoods where people of color could live after the introduction of covenants, and you see the freeways. So across the country, freeways displaced millions of people and destroyed neighborhoods, countless neighborhoods inhabited by people of color. In Minneapolis, near North Side was flattened. Seven Corners was split in half. What was known as the Old South Side was walled off from the whiter neighborhoods to the west. And these are classified ads that were placed by Black families in Minneapolis who were desperate to find new homes after their houses were condemned by the DOT. So here's one of the things that our team has come to recognize about covenants. These restrictions didn't just impose segregation. Covenants were actually used to keep people of color out of the city altogether. And developers soon realized that covenants only worked if they kept everyone out who was not white. So they needed to be put in place just as neighborhoods were being platted. So this is an aerial photograph of South Minneapolis that was taken in 1938. You can see there's not a lot there. And what these red polygons show is land that was already racially restricted before this photo was taken. As you can see, covenants are being embedded in the landscape before any development takes place. They predate the roads. They certainly predate the houses, the people, and even the sewers. The first thing that developers were thinking about once they acquired a piece of land is race. And this practice ensured that as American cities expanded, all new development was reserved for white people. Developers used covenants as marketing tools. They printed racial restrictions directly in promotional material. This is a newspaper ad from 1913 that stated that colored people, quote unquote, were excluded from this new neighborhood in St. Paul. And the developer promised that restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. So for me, this work that we're doing with racial covenants, it's not just an academic project. Obviously, this is about my hometown. And so it's perhaps not a big surprise that this research got very personal very fast. So even as Minneapolis and St. Paul pushed people out who were not white, it was welcoming newcomers like my grandparents. So a little about my family. My family, my grandparents were from immigrant families that had roots in Sweden. They started their adult lives with very little money and little formal education. Two of my grandparents were actually orphaned at very young ages. None of my grandparents made it past the 8th grade in terms of formal education. But they had a huge capacity for hard work. They labored as farmhands, they labored as domestic servants, lumberjacks, carpenters, and they drifted. I would say, well, drifted is perhaps not the right word, but they moved around small towns in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Montana, North Dakota, before finally deciding that they might have more luck in the big city. So they came to Minneapolis looking for opportunity. It's the classic immigrant story. During the Great Depression, my grandparents built businesses, they got married, they saved their money, and in 1942, both sets of my grandparents bought houses. So what this is a family film that my grandfather had made to celebrate this moment of acquiring a home. It shows how incredibly significant this was for my family. Of course, 1942 is before the era where you could have a handheld video camera. He must have hired an actual film crew. And it's actually all up on YouTube, so you can watch it. It's like 2.5 hours long. And it shows that they invited everyone that they had ever known to come and to celebrate this moment, and people are dressed up. They're in suits. The women are wearing dresses, it shows what a huge watershed this was for my family. But thanks to our map, I now know that this house was located on a block that was blanketed by racial covenants. The house itself had a racial covenant. The black icon in the upper right-hand corner of this map was my grandparents' house, and the red you see on the map is all covenants. My maternal grandparents lived nearby. Same story. Their blocks were also carpeted with these kind of discriminatory deeds. So the important thing to understand is that my grandparents were new arrivals. They were new Americans, but they were regarded as white. And that meant that they could build their lives in a place that was off limits to other Minneapolitans who had similar education levels and similar incomes. I grew up visiting my grandparents' houses. I grew up hearing stories from my parents about what it was like growing up in this neighborhood around Lake Nokomis, which sounded, it sounded pretty idyllic from their description. My grandmothers would shoo my parents out of their houses first thing in the morning, and the kids were outside all day. They were swimming at the lake, or they were skating in the winter. They're playing in the parks. They're roaming with bands of neighborhood kids. And perhaps even more importantly, the neighborhood had really solid schools. So both my parents went to college. My mother went to graduate school. But what I didn't understand when I heard these stories growing up is that all of this was only for white people. And my parents say that they never questioned why all their neighbors were Swedish, Norwegian, and German. This uniform whiteness seemed to be utterly natural, even at a moment in the city where the number of people of color was actually increasing dramatically. My grandparents bought their houses at a really important turning point for the United States. This was a moment where we saw the expansion of home ownership, the expansion of the largest expansion of the middle class in American history. And a lot of that prosperity rested on home ownership. And of course, home ownership had been really deliberately supported by new federal programs in the 1930s. The intervention of the federal government resulted in the birth of the modern mortgage, which made it possible to have payments over 15 or 30 years for a home, really putting home ownership in making it a possibility for a lot of families with really modest incomes. But these new programs, they introduced new mortgages for the first time. They also introduced redlining. And these discriminatory policies meant that 98% of FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962 went to white people. These programs were created to benefit people like my grandparents, and like the GI Bill, they excluded people who are not white. So 2 generations later, I'm still benefiting from the fact that my grandparents were encouraged to buy houses in a part of the city where property values climbed throughout the 20th century. Our research shows that today, more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, houses in Minneapolis, like my grandparents' house, that had covenants, are today worth 15% more than identical houses that did not have covenants. So, and my grandparents were able to pass on this additional value to me. When my grandfather died, my family sold his house and they distributed the proceeds to all the grandchildren. I was able to use my portion for a down payment on another home in a part of South Minneapolis that has all the same things that my parents talked about being so important to them in their formative years: solid schools, easy access to the chain of lakes. So I'm fortunate but not exceptional in this regard, and I'd love to hear your experience with the people you work with in this way. But there was a 2019 survey done by the National Association of Realtors that found that 30% of first-time homebuyers get help from family to manage the purchase of a home. So like many of my peers, I leveraged the economic security insecurity of earlier generations to secure the future of my children. And they are reaping the benefits of this in so many ways. But because my kids are the children of a historian, I tell them all the time, I remind them all the time that we all carry our history with us. I want them to know that their lives were determined in so many ways by the opportunities that were afforded my grandparents, that my grandparents took advantage of, right? I want them to know that these avenues for advancement that my grandparents really knew how to exploit were closed to people who were not white. That covenants worked with redlining. That's the federal policy that declared Black neighborhoods to be too hazardous for federal underwriting to depress homeownership rates for Black people. Well, they targeted anyone who was perceived to be not white using a definition that was capricious and ever shifting. The combined impact of covenants plus redlining was particularly devastating for Black people who were shut out of property ownership. Today in the Twin Cities, we have the highest gap between Black and white homeownership rates for any major metropolitan area in the country. I'm sure this is a statistic that you all know already. 75% of white families own their own homes. Only 23% of African American families can make that same claim. So property ownership, as we talked about at the beginning, it's important for so many reasons. Stable housing is at the foundation of so many other indicators of well-being. But in the United States, property ownership is really tied to citizenship in a lot of ways. And of course, it's also essential for wealth accumulation. You can draw a straight line between these historic restrictions on property ownership to the contemporary wealth gap. It's 10 to 1. Most white people don't have any sense of how big that gap is. That means for every dollar owned by the average white family in the United States, the average Black family has less than 1 dime. So what Mapping Prejudice is trying to do is we're trying to help people see this structural racism. And when I say structural racism, I mean collective racial prejudice that's backed by legal authority and institutional control. So racial covenants are classic manifestations of structural racism. Racism is not just a matter of personal bias. It's not just the sentiments of people like these protesters who picketed the Minnesota state hearings on fair housing in 1962. You can see their sentiments are very clear from their signs. What Mapping Prejudice is trying to do is help people look beyond this blatant racism to get people to see structures. We want people to see how racist ideology has been embedded into community institutions over decades. The way it's been written actually into the foundational documents of our communities. The way it undergirds our community maps. It sorts people into zones of privilege and dispossession, and it even means that people who live next to each other can have really different trajectories. This history helps us understand why it seems to be the same group of people who are vulnerable to housing insecurity, which of course affects the health, the educational opportunities, and job prospects of generations of people. Structural racism undergirds a system that was built to keep Black and brown people from owning property. It was designed to keep them from amassing wealth. It was designed to keep Black bodies out of places that are seen as desirable. It was designed to keep Black and brown bodies out of spaces that I was taught as a child belonged to all of us. So what do we do with this? So what do we do now? I would say that the time has come where we need to move from awareness to action. The time has come to make amends of some kind. We know that remembering is the first step on this journey, towards justice, but we have to have action. So I've already made a plug for this, but here's a place to start. You can help us document this history. We have weekly transcription sessions. We're looking to recruit volunteers to help us map Ramsey County and other communities, these racial restrictions. and of course, this is just a first step. We want you to do this work and then share what you've learned, obviously with the people that you're working with who are buying houses, but also with friends, with family members, with your elected officials. We need you to vote. It's up to all of us to make sure that this awareness that we're trying to build through Mapping Prejudice translates into real action. We need to avoid the mistakes of the past. I was very moved when this spring City Councilman Jeremiah Ellison wrote an op-ed piece, a commentary in the New York Times after his grandmother died of COVID. And he said that during every crisis, well-meaning white people make a ritual of acknowledging the city's steep inequities, as if people think that mere acknowledgement is the work. Acknowledgement is the first step, but the work is more than this, of course. But to figure out what needs to change, we need to listen to the people who are most affected. One place to start is this policy agenda that was developed by a group called the Alliance, which is a collection, a coalition of housing and growth organizations that are led by people of color. I would say that it's fair to say that the solutions are going to cost money. We need to invest in housing, we need to invest in schools and neighborhoods and people, but we have to think about what the alternatives are. And we also have to remember that it's not just money, it's also moral capital. It goes beyond financial capital. We need to think about reparations in this holistic way, in the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, as the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. We need to think about more than what he calls a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. And in thinking about it that way, we can imagine a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. So I am ready to be part of this renewal, and I hope that you will join me. So with that, I would love to open it up for questions and hear more about what your experiences have been in working with people.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. So anybody that has any questions, please feel free to send it through with the Q&A or in the chat. We'll try to get as many answered as we can. Let's see. Maybe one to start out. I know you mentioned that the map in the beginning that you showed of the pockets was the only one of its kind, but have you heard of other cities or communities creating projects or initiatives similar to Mapping Prejudice Project?
So we actually, so there's a couple of projects around the country that are similar to Mapping Prejudice. There's a project in Seattle. There's a project in Washington, D.C. There's a newer project in Charlottesville, Virginia. There's a project in Iowa City. But I am happy to say that we have actually received some grant funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is intended to make it possible for us to share all of the tools that we've developed to do this work, to give them to communities around the country that want to do this work. And we're in conversation with, I would say, almost a dozen different communities where it's been coalitions of groups that have approached us and have been really interested in replicating the process that we've developed here. So we really hope that we can empower lots of communities around the country to do the same kind of work, and also then maybe bring all the data and all the research in under the same digital umbrella so that people can come to the University of Minnesota and see, get sort of a bigger picture of these racial restrictions around the country, because we know that this was happening everywhere.
Another question that came through, do you have any stats on Native Americans that own houses presently?
I don't have that statistic at the tip of, at the tip of my tongue, but I know that it's even more, the inequities are even greater for Native Americans and white families. And people often ask us about why are Native Americans not named in the language of the covenants? And I think that's a really intriguing question. I mean, we think that that early covenant that I showed you, the first covenant from 1910 that talked about people of the Mongolian race, we think that was like an early 20th century reference to Native Americans. It was meant to target Native Americans. But I think it's also important to recognize that it was actually after the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 here in Minnesota, it was illegal for people to be openly Dakota and living in Minnesota. That there was actually a state law on the books that made it illegal for Dakota people to live here. So yeah, so I would say anything that we have traced, African Americans, Black people were the main target of covenants, but I would say the implications were even greater for Native Americans with these policies.
Let's see. Another question coming through. Is it part of the work going through the deeds and removing the racial restriction language? Is it part of
yeah, I'm excited to talk about that. Is there anyone here? I know Lyndon has been part of the Just Deeds Coalition. Is there anyone else here who's been part of that, that organization? Or that, in 2019, a group of legislators led by Jim Dabney and Jeff Hayden passed a new law in Minnesota that made it possible for Minnesota property owners to do what's called discharge a covenant if they found this kind of language in attached to a property that they owned. It doesn't mean erasing the language, doesn't mean getting rid of a covenant. It means just registering your objection to the covenant. So before that law was passed, it was actually very complicated. You had to hire a lawyer and know a lot about the way property law worked in order to do that process. Now, theoretically, it should be that you can just file an online form and make it happen. In reality, it's still complicated. And so there's actually a group called the Just Deeds Coalition, which is a group of people in the real estate industry, lawyers, some people, policymakers, some local elected officials from some of the first-ring suburbs who've all come together to create a cadre of volunteers who will help people walk through that process. So I want to put that resource out there for people. If you are working with people who are buying a house and you find a covenant attached to a property, that's an organization that exists now to help people navigate this process of discharging a covenant from their deed. I have to admit that I think that's great that this process exists. I also feel a little bit ambivalent about it. Not that it's not something that I want people to do. I just don't want people to feel like by discharging the covenant that their work is done. That their connection to this history is somehow over. I want people to see that as a moment for education, where they can discharge the covenant on their deed and then turn their attention to the community and figure out, what can I do to support policies or efforts that increase homeownership opportunity for people, that increase access to affordable housing for people, that make housing opportunities more equitable for people, that address racial justice, all those things. So I really, and that's where I would love to make this pitch to all of you, because you're sort of in the front lines at those moments for people, to see it as an opportunity for more community involvement, if that makes sense.
Yes, and somebody was asking the best way for realtors to help the project. So it sounds like that's a great place to start.
And I'll find the I'll find the connection to if you go to Golden Valley, the Golden Valley City website, and you Google Just Deeds, you can see a link to the Just Deeds project, and that's a great place. Yeah, if you have someone who has a question about a covenant in a property that they own or they're thinking of owning, that's a place to go. It's also a place to go in terms of thinking about what your next steps are.
And then some people are asking if you can show that screen with the information on where to go for more information or to volunteer again.
Yeah, so let's see, I put out, should I put it in the chat, or there seems to be two kind of threads going here.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering where I should answer.
Is it the mappingprejudice.org?
Yes.
I will throw that in the chat again, and I can answer in this other thread as well. And then
Iowa City project contact info, please. Okay. Maybe what I can do, is there like going to be is there a registration list? I can put some of these resources, these links in a list for everyone who's participating in the seminar. Would that make sense?
That would be great. Yes, we will send a follow-up email with
to
all the registrants, so we can include that for sure. Let's see. And then another question, how's your data being used to dismantle existing covenants?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We're not dismantling the covenants in the sense that they are illegal. But the data, a lot of people didn't know, maybe that they had a covenant attached to the deed of their house. So obviously it's a resource, it's a data point for individual property owners. In Hennepin County, though, the county has decided the county commissioners are crafting a resolution that responds to our research into this history, that they want to insert into every property parcel that has one of these racial restrictions attached to it. And it's meant to be sort of a universal renunciation, I guess, of these practices, because it's, I point the finger at, real estate developers who are the ones who really crafted this language. But I think it's really, I want to be really clear that it wasn't just the real estate industry. It wasn't just the bankers. It was also city planners. It was cities. It was counties. It was the federal government. Everybody supported these kinds of racial exclusions on property. And so two of the organizers of this Just Deeds coalition, a woman named Maria Cisneros, who's the city attorney for Golden Valley, and another man named Jared Shepard, who's he's in private practice, but he's head of the Minnesota City Attorneys Association. So it's they have pointed out that again and again they see historical material from cities across the state that indicate how much municipalities really supported all of these efforts to segregate, to put these racial exclusions in place and to segregate communities. So what was the question? It was like how do these renounce? So I think the point is just that we need to be working on so many different levels, right? That this ideology, these restrictions, these exclusions are embedded into every single different structure in our community. So that's I want to emphasize that I wish I could say, you know what, the solution is simple. You support this bill or you support this measure, but the reality is that these things are so multi-layered that we need to be working on so many different fronts. That's why there's not like one answer about like what to do. I always put up the policy agenda that was developed by the Alliance because I think it's really important to listen to people of color at this moment, because they're the ones who are most proximate to the problem, and therefore I think probably have the best ideas about actually what needs to be done. So that's one place I always point people to. I think there's a couple of, I see another question about, again, like action points. What are the action points? And we've developed a little bit of just a discussion guide for people who are thinking about, like, what's the connection between the past and the present, and what's the arc from awareness to action. I don't want to be too, what's the word? I don't want to be too directive in the sense that I think everybody needs to find their own path. But again, like, I'll point to the policy agenda of the Alliance, the Homes for All Coalition. I'm guessing that many of you are probably really familiar with that. That's a huge statewide coalition of 240 different organizations that all come together every year to endorse a policy platform that they bring to the state legislature with the idea of these are some public investments that we need to support the expansion of both affordable housing and home ownership. And that includes every kind of organization you can think of, from, Catholic Charities to Habitat for Humanity to the YMCA to the YWCA, many different faith organizations of one kind or another. I think another really important thing to support right now is the city of St. Paul just passed a safe, it's called the Safe Tenant Ordinances, new regulations for tenant landlord relations that provides more protections for people. I mean, I think it's not only do we need to expand affordable housing, we need to keep people, especially right now, in the housing that they're already in. Obviously doing that in a way that's safe for everyone. So those are some of my initial thoughts, and I would love to hear from all of you about what your thoughts are on some of these things.
Do you have thoughts on the Minneapolis 2040 project?
So the 2040 plan really used our data heavily to illuminate again, like, the connections between the past and the present. And one of the things with 2040 is was the city really wanted to make a case that, again, these racial disparities there was nothing natural about them, that they were actually created through explicit city policies. So our data points help them demonstrate that, for instance, the very same year, the very same month that racial covenants were made illegal by the state legislature was the same moment that the city of Minneapolis adopted single-family zoning for the first time. Before that, there was no single-family zoning in Minneapolis. And we don't have a smoking gun, to show that the city council adopted these new zoning regulations because racial covenants were made illegal right at that same moment. But the result was basically that the new zoning regulations really locked into place the residential patterns that had taken shape through these earlier practices. And so 2040 in part was an attempt to dismantle some of that. Mapping Prejudice does not endorse 2040, but we always say that it's clear that some action needs to be taken. I think we're skeptical, like a lot of people, like a lot of organizations, about whether or not just changing zoning regulations is enough. We would never say that that would be enough to address these racial disparities. And there's certainly, we're really sympathetic to a lot of people, especially in majority Black neighborhoods, who are worried that this new density is actually going to have a gentrification effect and push people out of neighborhoods rather than increase the access to more affordable housing. So How's that for a wishy-washy answer? Diplomatic, I think is the answer, right?
Another question was, with the prices of homes in the covenant areas being inflated to the point that they're out of reach for most minorities, how should the cost of living in the restricted areas be addressed?
You mean what to do about that? Like how to, yeah. And again, like that is so outside of my wheelhouse in terms of policy remedies. I would be remiss, I think, if I tried to come up with a policy solution for that. But I think the point is that there are a lot of policy solutions. I know enough to know that there are a lot of really smart people who work in this area every day who have come up with things, and I'm not endorsing this, but things as wide as for instance, linking property taxation to income, or to in neighborhoods where home prices have been really depressed, having some kind of property tax forgiveness policies. Like the idea is to allow people to hold on to property that maybe has been in their family for generations, or yeah, I mean, but it's clear that we need both more different kinds of housing for people that's more accessible, and we need help for people to get in that housing, to stay in that housing, and then also all kinds of everything from down payment assistance to assistance navigating the whole process of buying a house, that are going to get more people into stable housing where they can amass wealth and have stability over multiple generations.
Another question, why did some suburbs have a large migration of African Americans, like Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Centers, while others like Maple Grove or Plymouth did not? Was it redlining and deed restrictions, or something else?
Yeah, I don't know about Brooklyn. I mean, I do know that Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center did not have deed restrictions, so that definitely played a role. Some of the suburbs that we think of as perhaps more open to diversity, like St. Louis Park, has a tremendous density of racial covenants in it, as does Edina, with less surprising maybe for people. Yeah, so I guess I have to say I don't know about those specific suburbs.
Another question, how can we get lawmakers and local elected officials to see this presentation?
I'm all ears. I mean, if you, I go anywhere. I'm very easy, actually. So, so we've presented before the city council. We have presented at some smaller subcommittees in the legislature. I think, but we're eager to put this data in front of people who are in a position to make a difference. So.
And do you know if there are any policies being proposed right now that would help Black and people of color individuals with home ownership?
Yeah, I'm not aware specifically. I think there's, again, like the places to go are look at Habitat for Humanity. Look at their website. They're very involved in the policy realm. Look at the Alliance. They're very involved in the policy realm. They're always like on top of like whatever the newest policy decisions are. Those are two places that I think I did just have a meeting with the director of housing for the city of St. Paul, and she was talking about proposed increases for the housing fund for the city. I think that obviously is critical to get more resources into housing. So anything that we can all do to support those efforts and not see it. I think what Mapping Prejudice hopefully can do is that a lot of times when I have seen housing groups or seen people who are working in housing justice, they assume that everyone understands that there's a crisis, and that the crisis was created, right, and that it can be uncreated. I think what I hope that we can do as a project is help people see that there is a crisis, understand that by taking action, we can undo the work that was deliberately done in the past. That this is not something that we have to live with. It's a choice, and we have to just have the political will to actually want to undo the work that people have done in the past.
Have you heard of, like, similar to first-time home buyer incentive programs, but specifically for these communities that have been excluded from?
I think the place to go for that information is, do you know about the Minnesota Homeownership Center? Do any of you know Julie Guggen? And I think that they have really, that's a great resource. They do everything from, and they've been partnering a lot with Habitat for Humanity, I know, in terms of providing all kinds of supportive scaffolding resources, like classes for first-time home buyers, down payment assistance, all kinds of assistance for people. I feel like, Lyndon, weren't we talking about this in one of our conversations? Can you weigh in here at all and help me out?
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen. So we formulated for the diversity and equity and inclusion. We made a task force, and it's to do this type of thing. What we're talking about now, one of the main things is to change policies and laws in there, and we need to change the policies and laws so we can get things together and make an avenue where we can get some financial stuff and whatnot to do. We're working with a lot of other entities to help us do this, but we're really excited about what we're going to do now and what the atmosphere has lent us to get our foot in the door, if you will. So yeah, good things are coming, definitely, Chris.
Do you have a suggestion of specific things that we can all support, since it is an election year, and you know that I think there's a lot of things on that people are thinking about, but is there anything in particular that? Well,
there again, like I said, I mean, we got the normal, Minnesota Housing Finance, everything. We're trying to get them to get more money for first-time home buyer, down payment assistance, closing cost assistance. So the regular avenues right now, we're working with them and the city to try to get more money for them. But there again, we're trying to open up a new avenue. So right now we don't have the new avenues right now. It's just the regular ones that we have going, housing coalition and those avenues.
See another question. Someone asked, have you ever presented to the League of Minnesota Cities?
I feel like my colleague Kevin Urban Solberg might have, but if you think it would be helpful, we're happy to show up. So it's not just me. I'm part of a team of people, and if I can't make it, then I'm sure someone else can make it from our team. I'd be delighted. That's part of what we do.
Then regarding Minneapolis having the highest homeownership rate in the US, what is the percentage, and does that also include non-owner occupied units?
Can you help me parse that question a little bit more?
So
let's see.
Do you know the percentage of our homeownership in Minneapolis, it being the highest in the US?
Yeah, I'm not sure about Minneapolis. I know, isn't it, yeah, that's a great question. I understood it to be close to like 80%, right? But again, like I try not to ever talk about anything I don't know, and that's not a statistic that I have firmly.
Yeah, Kristen, I think you're right. I mean, as far as Minnesota, it's closer to that 80%.
Yeah, right. It's very high, right?
And then do we know, is that including rental units? I think that's what he means by non-owner occupied.
I understood that to be owner occupied. Like what's the, but
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen any breakdown of that myself.
And yes, we will be including the presentation in our follow-up email. We've got a couple questions about that. Another question, and yep, wanting your contact info. And then are you speaking with groups in person at all or just online?
yeah, not, it's actually the university's policy until the pandemic that we don't do any in-person events until it's, you know, safe for us to be in larger groups. So yeah, so this is what you get, the Zoom world for me. So I saw Ray Dean.
So
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Lyndon.
yeah, so Radine, so you are correct. We're the highest percent of home ownership, but we're also number one in the disparity gap
Right.
between African Americans and whites, and that's one of the reasons why Kristen and I and all these other people were trying to lower that disparity for sure.
Yeah, so it's like 23% of Black families own their house in the Twin Cities, and more than 75% of white families own their homes in the Twin Cities. And people, you know, people will sometimes say, well, you know, it's just that the gap is so high because white families are doing you know, are doing so well. But I like to point out cities like Memphis, Tennessee, have actually a much higher rate of Black homeownership than Minneapolis. I think Minneapolis, and like a lot of northern cities, likes to think of itself as, you know, really a progressive city that has really supported opportunities for a variety of people. And unfortunately, the numbers just don't back that up. And I think it's important to look at economics and wages and all that, but it's also really important for us to look at the structures. I was thinking about a meeting that we had with Julia Israel. I think probably many of you might know Julia. She's been really active in MAR over the years, and she's been an agent with Keller Williams, but she said, you know, we've had down payment assistance, we've had home ownership classes. What we need is we need the people who potential buyers are interacting with not to be racist too. Like that is a really important piece. And obviously I'm preaching to the choir here. All of you are showing up to a seminar about structural racism in home ownership, right? So thank you.
And then we had a question about, is there a breakout of all people of color? I'm not sure if he maybe meant a breakout session. I'll ping him in the chat. And then, yeah, we've had a few people share different stories and personal experiences.
Nice. I'd love to hear that.
Looks like. See, someone said, it's not a question, but currently housing prices are segregating folks yet again.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard when you work to support buyers who have limited resources and want to live in highly desired areas, but that are currently so white. Cause this leads through to how successful schools can be, since they are run on property taxes, and it's a systematic problem. And then yes, thanking you for the work you are doing, as we've had multiple people also share in the chat their gratitude.
Yeah. Yes, and I really want to support any efforts that that I think, like, I want to emphasize again, like, this is only going to change through the work of all these people, all of you, I guess. This is the only way that things change. And so I'm so grateful to all of you for coming, for listening, for doing this work with people one-on-one through the years. So anything I can do to support your efforts, I want to be of service.
Let's see, that question earlier, it sounds like breakout as in disaggregated data of BIPOC disparities is what that meant.
Yeah, I don't have those. I can find those, the disparities. I know that Native American home ownership rates are lower than Black, and I know that Latinx home ownership rates are slightly higher than Black families, and then I think Asian families are also higher. So yeah, so you can't. I try to be really clear in this presentation that I'm really talking about the distinction between white and Black, and in part because the experience of different groups is so different, is really variable. But we do that intentionally, in part because Black people were they were such explicit targets over such a long period of time by, for these measures and these practices.
Another question came through. I hear agents avoid this discussion by saying it's irrelevant since it was so long ago. Is it safe to say the first movement against racial covenants was the Fair Housing Act 50 years ago?
No, the movement against racial covenants far predated the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was like the culmination of, I would say, 20 or 50 years of activism on the part of people who fought these measures. So yeah, like I said, the NAACP really started the movement against racial covenants in the 1930s. It was one of the top issues of the NAACP, and yeah, it's been a long-standing, I would say, grassroots movement against these covenants, and they were always recognized as just like tremendous threats to liberty and to wellness for people. Yeah, so the Fair Housing Act, people really thought, okay, that's the end. The fight has been won. But what we found is actually there was not enough done after the Fair Housing Act to actually enforce this new law, to enforce the new guidelines.
And then leading off that, they're wondering if, in simple words, you could do a quick summary of how housing contributes to these racial disparities.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably all of you as realtors are very cognizant of this. Someone's already talked about about education. So it's not even just access to well-resourced schools, it's educational stability. For instance, if you're moving every year or every 6 months, you as a student, you don't have the chance to build those relationships with teachers and other students that really lead to a high quality educational experience. I personally had the experience of having a very significant health challenge, and I know how important stable housing was to me when I was getting treatment. If you're dealing with lots of doctor's appointments and lots of treatment of various kinds, if you don't have a stable address, it doesn't really matter. Obviously, where you live really determines your health. There was just a story in National Geographic that linked heat islands to racial covenants. So the research is pretty clear that areas of the city that had racial covenants are up to 10 degrees cooler than areas of the city that did not have racial covenants. And of course, that has everything to do with where were the trees planted, where are the parks, where are the green spaces, and higher temperatures lead to more health problems. It contributes to hypertension. It contributes to heart problems of one kind or another. How else can I dive into these disparities? Pretty much, if you talk to any medical professional, they will say that one of the best indicators of how healthy you are is what's your housing like. You know, everything from what's your water like? Are your pipes, you know, do you have lead pipes coming into your house? Do you have lead paint? Do you have green space around your house? Do you have good air quality? It all comes back to housing. And obviously access to amenities like grocery stores with healthy foods, mass transit where you can get to work easily. Yeah, housing is fundamental to everything, to every other aspect of your life.
Some research that one of our attendees has come across is that houses owned by African American families appraised for 20% lower than homes owned by white families. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just saw that article yesterday, actually. It's really making the rounds, and it seems very convincing to me. So yes. So it's complicated. It's not just So I think that's an example of how this these ideas about race and place continue to affect wealth accumulation. If you believe that a house that is owned by a person who is Black is inherently worth less because of the person who owns it, you know, because of the color of the skin of the person who owns it, that's an example of how covenants may be illegal, but the ideology that undergirded covenants continues to influence everything today, right?
Let's see, and then is there concern about potential racism when agents include letters or photos of their clients in multiple bidding situations?
I have, so again, this is out of my wheelhouse. I'd love to hear what some of you have to say. I've heard Julia Israel talk about that, but I'd love other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there, the association is working on that to make that illegal, but as of now, their suggestion is really not to do that. You know, they can't say don't do that, but they're highly suggesting not to do that because that could lead to some legal problems of discrimination.
Yeah, so it looks like in the chat, someone wrote an article about this and how love letters can be unfair and violate fair housing laws.
Wow.
Yeah. Also, along with a question you answered a little bit earlier, but for those of you who did not know, there is a lead-based paint window replacement program for Hennepin County. If you have clients who own homes with small children in them, to share with your clients. So that's good thing to put out there. Let's see. I'm not seeing any more questions specifically coming through. But yeah, people with experiences with the love letters. And again, more thanks for the presentation and that it's very eye-opening. And yeah.
This is such a funny, I'm really glad that we have these Zoom platforms so that we can continue connecting with each other. But it is a very, I'm so used to having all this sort of everything you get from a group. So thank you all for hanging with us in this somewhat awkward exchange. And I wish that I could meet all of you face to face and really have these conversations, because I'd love to hear you talking to one another and sharing your experiences more. I think that's just so important. So anyway, I'm very grateful to all of you for your patience.
So Kristen, we love to thank you. It was a great presentation as usual. And we really like to thank you for coming in and holding this presentation for us.
Yeah, well, thanks to all of you, and I would love to follow up. Please, if you have time or if you're inclined, please come to one of our volunteer sessions. Again, like they're once a week. We alternate between the afternoons and the evenings. You can go to our website, www.mappingprejudice.org, and go to the events section to see the times and figure out how to get registered. Again, it's all on a Zoom platform. I'm happy to talk to other groups that you're involved with. I think it's really super important to keep doing that. And I would love to share with you in a follow-up email. I'll talk to Anne and Lyndon and Jill and Marty about share some information about some of the other projects that are going on around the country. What else am I'll share the link to the Just Deeds group, and then maybe a couple other resources. Anything else that put it in the chat if there's anything else that you want me to share.
A question about if comments can be made public, but we will, like we just said, we will send a follow-up email with a list of all the resources as well as the recording from today and the presentation slides. So we will make sure to get that out to everybody, if not by the end of today, first thing tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
And with that, if there are no more questions, we can maybe end a little bit early. And thank you so much for your time today. And this presentation, as it's been said many times, has been very eye-opening and important stuff to learn. So,
okay, with that, I'm going to sign off. And thanks to all of you. And I'll be in touch through Mar. Okay.
thank you so much.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.